I enjoy just kind of walking through the exercise of these obviously very challenging geopolitical issues we're facing these days. And lo and behold, and pleased to see the number one issue you had on your list today was the idea that North Korea has now sent troops that are hanging out in Russia, going to be fighting against the Ukrainians in this crazy situation going. How do the North Koreans end up getting involved with this, Daniel?
Well, there's lots of information floating out there and lots of claims and accusations, but not a lot of actual evidence. And I'm still not completely convinced that some of these reports that the North Koreans are actively engaged on the front lines in the Kursk area are accurate. To date, I have seen a single photograph of someone that's alleged to be a killed in action North Korean soldier with his passport in front of him or something like that. All the rest of it has been claims. But here's what we do know: North Korean troops have been going to Russia to train for a long time. There's nothing actually new about that. And the initial reports showed both the U.S. and the Ukrainian intelligence services said that they were actually in the far east of Russia, not on the front lines. And then Zelensky came out subsequent to that and said, no, they're actually on the front line. And look, he's got some motivation. You always have to look at who's got motive for things to work out a certain way. And he's saying to everyone, hey, this marks a huge escalation. Everybody needs to come and join us and help us now. But then you look at the other side, and what motivation does the Russians have? And I'm not sure that there's any, because there is no shortage of Russian troops. I've actually talked to one particular UK soldier, UK citizen who went to fight on the Russian side. Very unusual. So I wanted to find out why he had done that. But he said, look, there's no shortage of personnel or equipment or ammunition or anything on our side. And he had not heard anything about the North Koreans. But let me also say that from a military perspective, and I've done this before in combat, when you fight with nations that different nations and you're fighting on the same battlefield, it is really difficult. And this number that's been bandied around, 7 or 8,000, possibly 10 or 12, depending on who you want to talk to, that's a comparatively small number in a fight where there's somewhere around 800,000 Russian troops fighting alongside. So it's not going to make any kind of operational difference, and the difficulty would be really high for the Russian side at very little gain. So it's unclear to me what's really going on, because lots of people are claiming different things.
Well, I suppose, from a Russian standpoint, and I'll acknowledge your point that they've got enough troops, they've got enough weapons, and they don't need the additional bodies. But from a Russian standpoint, if they want to join and help us with the fight, fine. But what's North Korea got to gain with this?
Well, yeah, and actually, I wanted to go down that path. In my view, you talk about who's got something to gain. North Korea has more to gain than anybody, if they wanted to, because their troops have not had any combat experience of any kind for decades, and I can tell you that is a big issue. So it would make sense to me, from a military perspective, if Kim Jong-un said, "Hey, we're giving you all these weapons and artillery shells, etc., but we want to get something out of it more than just cash or food. We want some experience for our troops." And so they may send them in to say, hey, teach us the most new and current combat operations, the way tactics are being done right now, and maybe even say, hey, let us get some actual combat in there. I don't know for sure what's going on, but it would make sense from North Korea's perspective to get some combat experience.
Well, is that combat experience, and then the more jaded and cynical view that I was going to interject is maybe the North Korean soldiers want a meal for a change, so they're going to get fed by the Russians as opposed to what their rations are in North Korea. Just saying.
Yeah. Well, as it turns out, the regular North Korean people do indeed have privation in food, but the military, and especially their special forces, have always been given a lot more than other people. So they do well, while the rest of their countrymen don't.
All right, before we pivot over to what the election will have by way of consequence for foreign affairs, what is alarming to me, and I presume you as well, is this growing alliance with Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. They seem to be playing very, very nicely together, which presents a much greater threat than, the previously divided China and Russia. They never played nicely together. I think Nixon tried to take advantage of that by opening relations with China, hoping that they would become more Western and open to the concept of Western principles and idea. Obviously, it didn't go that way thanks to Tiananmen Square, but Russia and China now playing nice together, engaging in war game exercises. The Iranians enjoying the benefits of weapons back and forth. Obviously, they're supplying the Russian troops with drones, for example. I mean, this is not looking good from a global situation in terms of this new alignment of what are collectively we can characterize as our foes, our enemies, or folks that aren't on our side of the ledger anyway.
Well, look, I mean, Brian, we got to be honest. A lot of this is our own making. I
Oh,
mean, you
sure.
talked about the Nixon and what he'd done. That made sense for us. And so, you want to drive a wedge between folks, meaning you got to give somebody incentive not to want to be friends with the other. And we're doing the exact opposite. We're giving these guys every incentive in the world and motivation to come together. When before we went into and started supporting the Ukraine side in the war with Russia, those were basically all stovepipe. They were kind of all independent. They had some, especially Russia and China, had some relation, but it was arm's distance. And then North Korea and Iran were basically kind of stovepipes. They were at double arm's length. Now then, because we're supporting all these sanctions on Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and we're actively providing weapons for Russia. We're giving them every reason in the world to say, okay, there's no value in doing anything on your side, so we're going to do things together. And then now it's turned into outright military alliances and agreements between Russia and North Korea and Russia and Iran. So the more we push these guys, the more they get together. And you're right, the bigger potential problems that poses for us on the international stage. You don't have to look any further than BRICS to see the economic fallout of that.
I was waiting for bricks to come out. I was waiting for the word to come out of your mouth, Daniel. I knew it. Now, as we can now pivot over to the election. Obviously, we're voting today, and I encourage my listeners to get out and vote. I don't know how you feel about either candidate, and I think it's immaterial to my comment. Kamala Harris's commander in chief scares the living hell out of me. Daniel, I have to be honest with you. If she's incapable of answering a single question without sounding silly or like some college professor word salad nonsense on domestic issues, I haven't heard a word from her about foreign policy. Now, that is not to say I believe Donald Trump is going to be elected and can lay hands and make these problems go away immediately. How he's going to do that, he hasn't said. He promises to do it. At least he can point to his record where it was a lot more peaceful under the Trump administration, but there's no guarantee we get a return to peace. So what are we left with, Daniel Davis? Opinions? We all have one.
Yeah, I have to confess that I also have some real concerns about a Harris presidency, just because she has literally no experience at all. When she was in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, was sent to a lot of international locations. It went very poorly, you may
Yeah.
recall, and then they kind of took that off her plate. So there hasn't been any more since that time. And personnel is policy. You may have heard that phrase before. And one of the big holes in any of our knowledge is who is going to be her senior leaders. Now, I'm here in Washington, D.C., and I'm actively looking to ask people who are her senior advisors, who would be maybe some of the key people in her cabinet should she be elected. And hardly anyone knows, which is alarming to me because I'm not sure if she gets elected, who is actually going to be calling the shots there? Because apparently it's not going to be the current Secretary of State, Defense, or National Security Advisor. Apparently they're all going to go. But who is it going to be? On the other side, on the Trump side, I actually do know a lot of people that are being actively considered for roles. And I'll just tell you, it makes me very happy in some of those. So I'm not going to tell anybody who to vote for or talk about domestic issues, but in foreign policy, some of the people who are being talked about at the highest levels for the Trump administration are good folks.
Well, that gives me comfort. And because in my listening audience, a vast majority of at least Trump leaning folks, maybe not necessarily outright, always Trumper type of folks, but when faced with a choice between Harris and Trump, at least insofar as foreign policy and America's military, you have more confidence in the folks that Trump might be appointing in those roles. And that, of course, gives me confidence that my listeners are at least on the right side of the ledger on that. You and I will be talking a lot more about this. Sadly so, but I welcome these conversations. It's going on, needs to be addressed, and I really appreciate your take and your standpoint. Look for him online wherever you get your podcast. Daniel Davis Deep Dive. I'll look forward to it as I always do next Tuesday, my brother. Have a wonderful week, and fingers crossed for a smooth transition regardless.
Yes, yes. No matter how it turns out, I pray that it's peaceful and that it's legitimate and everybody understands how it turned out.
I share your prayer in that regard. Take care, my friend.